There's something unquestionably cinematic when you see black bars around your screen. You'll be watching an episode of anime with its usual 16:9 aspect ratio, and then black will slowly creep onto your screen. And despite reducing the size of the screen, you'll still find yourself sitting up in your chair, anticipating that something serious is about to go down. In reality, the black bars are actually a result of trying to fit a movie screen resolution on a less wide TV aspect ratio, but regardless of the original intent, you can still easily make the connection that boxing your scene between two black bars evokes a movie-like experience, even when it's just television. It's amazing how much emotion two black rectangles can elicit. However, the power of these borders are not just limited to the size of your television. You can incorporate these rectangles and borders within the composition itself. This is commonly referred to as a frame within a frame. If the first level of framing is the shape of your image or screen, then the frame within refers to using the visual elements in a scene to create a border or frame around a subject. Think of things like putting your character inside a window or within a doorway. In the same way, those cinematic black bars give you the feeling that you're at a theater. Framing your characters or action can similarly create a particular ambience or reflect a certain emotion. This simple technique imbues an otherwise plain shot with additional meaning and gives direction for the viewer on how to interpret loaded dialogue or navigate dubious intentions. To learn more about how to utilize frame within a frame, we can turn to one of my favorite mechas, 86. 86 is about a war held between the Republic of San Magnolia and the Gyadian Empire. While the latter fights with autonomous robots known as legions, San Magnolia's Alba-led government forces the Colorado minorities to pilot their robots. These marginalized individuals are known as 86, former members of the Republic who were stripped of their human rights in order to act as fodder for the war, while the Alba lived in blissful ignorance. At the end of part 1 of 86, Shin, or Shin Nozen, and the remaining survivors of his group escape San Magnolia and are eventually offered a new lease on life as part of the Federal Republic of Giad in part 2. But peace doesn't come easy to Shin and his fellow child soldiers, and the second core focuses on Shin's difficulty in finding a reason to continue living. Despite how cool and emotionless Shin may appear, he has plenty of emotional baggage weighing him down. Between the survivor's guilt Shin feels towards his countless dead squad mates and the aimlessness from him finally avenging his brother's death in part 1, Shin is just having a terrible time in the second core. He truly feels trapped in this life with nothing to look forward to. This misery is faithfully reflected in the show's cinematography by framing Shin and the cast in borders of various shapes and forms. These visuals are especially effective in a show like 86 because of how little Shin actually expresses himself. He's quiet, restrained, and very professional, and his gradual and depressive spiral would not be as discernible without this visual technique. Through these various forms of framing, we can examine how the show plots this gradual development towards Shin's nadir. I would say the primary way to utilize framing is to highlight separation and isolation. The frame creates walls to segregate your subject from other characters and surroundings, and we see this come to immediate effect at the start of part 2 of 86. When Shin and his friends join the Federal Republic of Giad, they are clearly shown to be outsiders, in spite of the warm welcome given to them by the government and the respect shown to them by its citizens and military. The 86 still feel out of place in this new country, whether at the gun range, facing alienation from fellow soldiers, or in the car disagreeing with his superiors. Shin finds himself isolated in a world all of his own. This technique isn't reserved for just the 86 versus the others. This overhead shot of Shin talking to Raiden punctuates a misunderstanding by utilizing a single wire or pipe on the ceiling that passes through the center of the composition. All of these shots create some visual division that demonstrates how the characters are misaligned in some way. One particular example I love from the 86's time in Giad is Theo and Anju meeting under a pavilion. Though not explicitly about Shin, this situation resonates with all members of the 86. They've all blended into Giad, but still find themselves on the outskirts from time to time. Beneath the pavilion, Theo and Anju find themselves enveloped in a moment of reflection, split from Giad and their civilian lives. When asked whether or not Anju had plans on her new life, Anju, from within the pavilion, is separated from a couple cheerfully walking outside. The hair colors just so happen to match Anju and that of her crush who had died in part 1. It's a bit of a low blow from the directors on how Anju lost her chance at a happy future. The pillars of the pavilion clearly separate Theo and Anju from a normal civilian life they cannot even imagine partaking in. Instead of embracing new opportunities afforded to them in Giad, they are trapped in this mindset and visually in the structure, of continuing the fight and honoring the memories of their fallen comrades. Making use of the architecture in this manner really hammers home those points. Among the structures I discussed earlier, windows and glass are a particular type of frame that draw extra meaning from their reflectiveness and transparency. Windows suggest observation. People can see through them, but the subjects they see are inaccessible due to the physical boundary. Ernst at first communicates with the 86 through a glass window. It sets up an emotional distance between him and the 86 that reveals how little he really understands them. Windows cast the 86 as outsiders in their new home when they observe from behind the car glass. Similarly, Frederica is confined behind the glass and is rendered a bystander who can only helplessly watch her comrades go off to war. The glass adds a layer of complexity in the separation between the observer and the subject. They are still distinct, but there's a higher level of understanding on the observer's end about how they are aware of what's going on the other side, but they are unfortunately denied the chance to interact or cross over. Another application of Windows in 86 is the ability to imply via reflections. We've always been told to show, not tell, and 86 embodies that phrase by suggesting emotions or relationships using Shin's reflection instead of his actual body. It matches the stoicism of his character and lets conversation feel more natural while still informing the viewers about his true feelings. As an example of the former, Shin's reflection is used to depict his grief over the news of the Legion conquering San Magnolia. With San Magnolia falling, it's likely that Lena, an Alba he befriended in part 1, has died. Rather than have an emotional outburst, Shin bottles up that regret, refusing to open up to anyone. With nowhere else to turn, the camera cuts to a shot of his reflection in the window, where a leftover raindrop falls down, the closest imitation of a tear we will ever see from Shin. He gets to keep repressing his emotions, but the viewer gets to be privy to the internal agony Shin feels. For another example of how reflections can reveal hidden feelings, we can examine this earnest conversation between Frederica and Shin. Frederica reveals her past to Shin and tells the story of her former knight who died in battle with the Legion. She mentions how similar he and Shin are, and it's during this conversation that Shin's visage is reflected in the window. Without saying it directly, the show implies that the conversation is really about Shin, and that Shin is doomed to the same fate unless he changes something. The camera even emphasizes this fact by slowly pulling Shin's reflection to the center of the composition while pushing Frederica, the actual speaker, out of frame. This point is further punctuated by the shot from outside the window. Like a moth caught in a web, Frederica's knight meets their demise after falling into a trap. Similarly, the grills of the window lie over Shin, ensnaring him in its web. Windows, as framing devices, gives access to an additional technique in mirrors, which can be used to unmask hidden feelings or see past the superficial dialogue. While I've already discussed how framing depicts separation, I also want to dedicate some time on how framing can specifically be used to direct the viewer through conflict. The frames I've discussed so far have remained stationary, trapping characters within rigid boxes. However, frames can shift and characters can play around these boundaries, both of which can be used to emphasize the dialogue. After attempting to live as civilians, Kurina musters up the courage to admit to the rest of the 86 that she wants to return to being a soldier. She's isolated from the others via a doorway in the dining room, but upon everyone else agreeing with her, she walks through the doorway over the frame, signaling their alignment. The act of crossing frames can suggest a change in dynamic, and the doorway also visually aids the flow of conversation by separating Kurina from the other 86. One of my favorite applications of framing in this part of 86 is how it highlights the growing rift between Shin and his fellow 86. During their time in Giad, the crew had struggled with their futures as civilians, but upon rejoining the military, the 86 began to share aspirations for future endeavors, except of course, for our protagonist. Though those goals remain as innocent as just being able to see the sea, Shin can't even look forward to those small pleasures. There are frames built using his mecha, and even shadows to help depict that particular division. It comes to a climax when Raiden confronts Shin about his behavior on a bridge. The framework of the bridge compartmentalizes the two into two boxes, visualizing their disagreement. Raiden wants Shin to stop fighting like a man looking to die, but Shin refuses to acquiesce. The railroads beneath the bridge also aid in the composition. Raiden's straight rails indicate his clear path towards survival, while Shin's broken rails reflect his suicidal tendencies. When Shin tries to run away from the conversation, Raiden forces Shin against the fencing of the bridge. When Raiden reaffirms that he and the rest of the team will support him, the two are then pictured together in the same box above rails that are both straight. Raiden is forcefully breaking down the walls Shin is putting up, and desperately trying to put him on the right track. The same episode contains several other uses of framing to support conversation in this manner. Just moments later, Kurina tries to defend Shin's actions to Theo and Anju. Their differences in opinion are made clear by the openings of an abandoned train station around them. but the placement of Kurina inside the window with broken glass cleverly suggests to the viewer her biased perspective. This is particularly evident when compared to the cleaner doorway framing Theo and Anju. Another instance is Shin's conversation with Frederica before the final battle. They find themselves in a cavernous space where Shin is dwarfed inside the groove of a giant pillar. The wreckage of their campsite is littered with jagged rocks and steel rods, constantly surrounding him with sharp objects. They reveal the hopelessness Shin feels in escaping his nihilism, which he admits to Frederica in private. These aren't especially difficult conversations to follow along, but the visual metaphors through the framing enhance their delivery and serve as subconscious guidelines. We've established many uses of frames within frames, but the neat part about creative pursuits like anime is that once you know the rules, you can then break them. That's why the finale of 86 Part 2 is so infamous in the community. After the climactic battle, Shin is ready to give up on life. He dreams of the many friends and family who have left him behind. Throughout the core, Shin has always been haunted by memories of his fallen comrades, these ghosts who thank him for keeping their memory alive. They have reaffirmed to Shin that they're going ahead of him to the afterlife. But in this sequence, it becomes clear that these aren't the ghosts of his past coming to taunt him. These are self-inflicted wounds, and they manifest as black bars that begin to attack him. From the black frame, a shadow Shin, for lack of a better phrase, appears and verbalizes all his fears of abandonment and meaninglessness after he defeats the Legion's railgun unit. Those cinematic black bars are personified by this figure, and the blending of the shadow Shin with the black frame defines the relationship between his insecurities and the framing. He is then placed on top of the black bars as his remaining friends announce their departure from behind them, again portraying the distance between him and them. They're not even the same plane anymore. He tries to reach out to them, but the black bars become corporeal. They cut him when he finally asks for help, and they grow in size to further box Shin in. But just when Shin has lost all hope, Lena arrives. Their developing relationship was the cornerstone of 86 Part 1, and news of her possible death had intensified Shin's mental decline in Part 2. But her return reinvigorates his will to live. She boldly claims the foreground, stepping over the black bars as if to override Shin's negative thoughts. The black bars transform into transparent white ones. That darkness that was closing in on him is lifted, and his judgment is no longer clouded by his aimlessness and depression. Lena's unwavering commitment to remembering him and her determination to stand by his side as an ally inspire Shin. He has found the reason to keep going in life. He reaches out upwards, where there was once a window of thorns, but now remains a clear and unencumbered sky. Shin is at last free from the frames. In spite of the unconventional composition, 86 manages to impart a wide gamut of emotions to the audience. It's really impressive how natural this entire sequence feels, and how obvious the meanings of these black and white bars are to the viewer. Shin and Lena's reunion is filled with incredible iconography, and the artistic liberties the show takes with these black bars truly elevates the story. This is exactly what cinematography and visual language brings to the narrative. It clarifies complex emotions and enhances the viewer's reception of the story beats. And it adds compositional variety, which makes the more exposition-heavy episodes of 86 much more engaging. I spoke earlier about how everyone likely understands the intrinsic emotion two black rectangles can bring to a show or movie. In the exact same manner, these frames within frames get your mind more attuned to the conversation and narrative. Once you're aware of how often frames within frames appear, you won't be able to stop yourself from seeing those boxes and shapes in all sorts of anime from now on. And hopefully you'll come to agree that there's something inherently cinematic about a frame within a frame.